I wanted to make a video about my experiences with the Fat Shark T2 goggles, and first I thought I would start with the equipment I used. I flew a Flex RC Ascent 2.5-inch frame with a Runcam Split Mini V1 camera and an HGLRC TX20 V2 VTX with the stock whip antenna, and it was at 350 milliwatts. For the receiver in the goggles, I used an Immersion RC Rapid Fire receiver module, a FarView Pagoda 2 omnidirectional antenna, and a True RC X2 Air directional antenna. Now, everything in this video is going to be based on my experience, and I have only owned a few pair of goggles. I've owned, let's see, this is my fourth pair of goggles, but it's my first pair of high-end goggles. And as you can see in the video, I'm not a great pilot yet, but I do love to fly through trees, and so I did my testing in some dense trees. I wanted to see how well I could see branches, and I wanted to see how much it breaks up as I'm flying through the trees. It was a little hard to get used to these goggles coming from box goggles, so that made it so I had to fly a little more carefully than I normally would as well. Overall, the goggles were quite comfortable to me. They have a leather type padding that was comfortable, but I think it did cause me to get a little bit sweatier than I'm used to wearing goggles. They were lighter weight than my box goggles, that's for sure, but they were heavier than my Eachine EV100s. The screens in the goggles are pretty big, but I'm coming from some 5-inch box goggles, and so they weren't drastically as big as I thought they would be after hearing other people's opinions of them. The edges of the screens are blurry. That is a problem for me because I like to put most of my OSD down in the bottom corners, and that made it very difficult to see the OSD information. With that said though, the screens are much more clear than any of the other goggles I own. Surprisingly even more clear than my 1080p screens that come in the Eachine goggles too. And an interesting point that I'd never realized before, my Eachine goggles too have a lot of lag, especially compared to these goggles, these Fat Shark T2s. And maybe that's because of the high-end receiver I put in the T2s, but I just couldn't believe how much smoother the video was in the Fat Sharks. A few of the times while I was flying, I got some screen roll that would go away after a few seconds. It would take a few seconds to lock on, and then the video would be clear for the rest of the flight. But I assume that probably has something more to do with the receiver module than the goggles themselves. But that is something I've never seen in any other goggles that I've owned. Now, the things I noticed about the DVR. I have not had goggles with a DVR before, so this was my first experience with one. The video quality in the video that I'm showing is not as good as it was in the goggles. The DVR video is not as high quality as the goggles. The menu system, I think it's a good menu system, but for some reason I really struggled getting used to it, and I would constantly cancel out of the DVR over and over when I wanted to watch the footage or start it recording or something. The DVR felt a little overcomplicated to me, just because you have to turn on the DVR before you can even tell it to start recording. I feel like goggles, the DVR should just come turned on. There is a mode for the DVR called Auto Start Continuous, so that it will automatically start recording when you plug it in. I haven't tried it yet, but I've heard that that's the mode to use so that you can get all the footage that you need, so that you don't forget to turn it on if your drone crashes and you need to review that footage to find it. There is one thing about the DVR that I wanted to really point out. That memory card is extremely difficult to get in, and it's even harder to get out. I'd use a flathead screwdriver to push down on the edge of the card and shove it down into the slot until it latched in place. To get the memory card back out, I had to use a flathead screwdriver to push down so the spring-loaded catch would release it and it would pop out, but it didn't pop out far enough that you could grab it. I had to get some fine-tip tweezers, reach down in there and tug on it, and it took several tries of tugging for it to actually come out because there was still quite a bit of friction holding the card in there. This really shouldn't be a problem for most users because they're not going to need to take the memory card out all the time. The only reason I need to is so I can show you the footage. I guess for most people this isn't a big deal. I like the fan. I haven't really used a fan in my goggles before. It was pretty quiet and it did keep the lenses clear. It was a hot day. I did get a little sweaty and the lens started fogging up, and the fan got rid of all the condensation really quickly. The downside of the fan is you have to plug in the balance lead of the battery to be able to turn the fan on, and I find that super odd that it's not just integrated in the goggles, but that it's a separate system that needs its own battery connection. Another funny thing about the fan is that you can't turn it off. It either has to time out or you have to unplug it. You can't just push the button that you used to turn it on to turn it back off. Another thing that does bother me about the goggles is it feels like there's a lot of separate systems in the goggles rather than being one whole unit. The fan, the screens, the DVR, the receiver, they all are separate. They all have to be turned on independently, and I don't understand why that can't all just work together. In summary, I really like the goggles. They're comfortable, they help me to see a lot better, which was why I got them. They are a huge improvement over what I was using before. Well, that's it for my review of the T2 goggles, and now I'll just let you watch the rest of my DVR test footage. I hope this was helpful. Thanks for watching.